Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this webinar organized by Jindal School of International Affairs of OP Jindal Global University in India. I see a very large audience comprising students and curious visitors from across the world joining in today. So it's really heartening to see the turnout. I request you all to post the names of the countries from which you are from and to let us know where all you're logging in from. I am the Dean of the School of International Affairs at Jindal Global University, and this event is meant to engage with all of you and to showcase some of our experts on matters of great global significance. As you know, the topic is this ongoing war, which has now entered the 6th month, starting February 2022. And it has been really devastating and has taken a huge toll. Humanitarian crisis with millions of people who've become refugees and internally displaced people, mass destruction of civilian infrastructure, huge losses on all sides. Tens of thousands of people have already been killed, war crimes being committed, and bigger issues of regional order in Europe and even, in fact, of world order. It's not a kind of a war that's insignificant or is simply confined to Europe, because the repercussions have been felt globally. There is a food, fuel, and financial crisis sweeping many parts of the world as we speak. And in fact, the war is not over. The title might suggest that the war is over, but the point is the war is still ongoing and is unlikely to wind down anytime soon. If at all it comes to a halt, it's not going to be through some big announcement, it seems, but just taper off slowly. But what kind of settlement will it be? And frankly, what is this new world order that we are entering? Many have been disappointed by the nature of this conflict, which seemed to be in the making for months, if not years, and why it could not be prevented, why the UN and other international organizations seemed helpless to bring the fighting to a stop, and also the great power tussle that has re-emerged globally. And what does it mean? Clearly, we are not in a post-Cold War order anymore. That order is over, and we have entered some kind of a new era that is searching for a definition. We don't know what it's likely to be called. I prefer to call it the era of emerging multipolarity, which sounds positive, but which will also involve many shocks, many crises, and many adjustments. So if you look at it structurally, this is not a kind of a easy situation that we are looking at. And this is likely to be a series of extended crises. And we are only at the beginning of what looks like a major tectonic readjustment of the international order, nothing less than that. So to discuss this kind of epic change that is happening in the international system and all its repercussions, I have with me a very distinguished panel of my own faculty colleagues from the Jindal School of International Affairs, many of whom actually teach courses for the online Masters in International Relations, Security and Strategy degree program, which is offered with Coursera. And you are, of course, quite familiar with it. This event is being co-hosted with Coursera. So I would like to, you have all seen the poster and the invitation for this. So I'm not going to introduce each and every speaker, but rather call on one of them and then the next one to start by reflecting on this crisis and how this war has changed the world, how this war has changed our own lives, and more importantly, what kind of new order are we looking at? So we have a lot of scholar practitioners of diplomacy today among our colleagues who are joining in, quite a few of whom also teach the online Masters in International Relations, Security and Strategy program. So I'm going to begin with the scholar practitioners and then go to the classic academics among my colleagues and further this discussion. So to begin with, let me please welcome Ambassador Mohan Kumar. He's a senior faculty member of the School of International Affairs. He's also Dean of our International Affairs and Global Initiatives Office in the university. He was India's ambassador to France and knows European politics better than most of us. So Ambassador Mohan Kumar, this war is dragging on and on endlessly, and it has just not delivered anything practical for any side. Even though Russia seems to have gained a little bit of territory, the kind of damages they have suffered economically as well as to their troops is tremendous. And of course, Ukraine has been devastated. And every day we see horrific images of buildings blown up and bridges in tatters and people fleeing in all directions. This has been, kind of a shocking war, even to the moral senses. And your thoughts on, what does this signify and what kind of world is this in your view that we are seeing? I mean, the cynical view is that this is might is right, and whoever is stronger, a great power or a major power, can violate sovereignty of smaller countries and can get away. But there are also other issues of great power confrontation because NATO is in the background. It's not just a war between Russia and Ukraine, but with the whole Western military alliance backing Ukraine. So this is the kind of lineup. It looks scary. I mean, are we looking at a world war type situation that will slowly emerge, or you think this is just pure disorder that will carry on? Your thoughts, opening thoughts, Ambassador Mohan Kumar.
Thank you very much, Professor Chaulia, and it's a pleasure and honor to be here today. I will try to be brief because there are others, and I think we should have some time for questions and answers as well. The first thing I want to say is that, as you rightly pointed out, the war is not over yet. So the two ways in which this can go is you can have a low intensity conflict which can last forever and ever. To my mind, that seems like a best case scenario until there is total attrition from both sides, and then they reluctantly come to a settlement. That is one way in which I see this conflict going. But as you rightly said in your opening remarks, meanwhile, it's taking a terrible toll. And I want to begin by saying that we are between two orders, two world orders. As you rightly underlined, it's very clear to me that the post-World War II order has definitively ended. I think it's not clear what will replace that world order. And that is why I'm saying we are between two orders. And between two orders, you're bound to have chaos, lack of clarity, countries jostling for geopolitical influence and so on. So this is why we are seeing what we are seeing, extremely fluid scenario. And for students of international affairs and practitioners, I would have to say this is probably or arguably the most interesting time actually. And that is why this course also makes a lot of sense, regardless of whether you are flipping burgers in McDonald's or you are an executive at Citibank. Regardless of what you're doing, I think this course can offer a lot of value. I would just say three implications and then leave the floor to others. Professor Chaulia, if you allow me just 2-3 minutes. One is a clear geostrategic outcome of this war, where I see the world divided into two blocks. There is a bloc led by Russia and China. There is a bloc led by West. You can call it NATO-led, whatever you want, but West. In between, you have a lot of countries which have not been able to make up their minds, or they want to retain options and they indulge in what I call strategic hedging. You hedge your bets because you are not convinced. I mean, this war is complex. And my only point would be, without taking sides, we should avoid a simplistic interpretation of the conflict. This conflict is extremely complex, and you have to understand the history of the conflict if you want to really understand what's going on, but we will not get into that. So, will countries like India be forced to take sides? That is one big question. ASEAN, India, Indonesia, Mexico, South Africa, Brazil, we have all been told that we are sitting on the fence. Now, this is fine as far as it goes, but will we be forced to make a choice on the road? So that is the first geopolitical, geostrategic implication, which will have a lot of profound ramifications for a country like India, which is used to practicing strategic autonomy. Secondly, the geo-economic implications, which are more imminent and immediate. One is a clear impact on commodity prices. There is food inflation, there is fuel inflation, cost of fertilizers. This is hitting emerging and developing countries much more than Europe. Europe is, of course, affected. I accept that. But I think we are overlooking the impact on Africa, Middle East, the cost of food. I think those are hidden costs of this war, which are affecting the poor and the vulnerable. So that is the clear geo-economic implication, which is why a lot of countries would wish that this war came to an end, that some compromise is worked out, and they have a settlement sooner rather than later. The last one is really the military implication of this conflict. I just want to conclude by saying those who believe land wars are a thing of the past, those who believe tanks are no longer of any value in a military conflict, those who believe you should not have enough troops, you can have robots, you can have drones. I think nothing could be further from the truth, frankly. If you see the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, several observers have said it reminds them of World War II, because you've got troops, you've got tanks, and you are fighting classic original way. So the military implications of this conflict is very important for a country like India, which has a long border with China and a border which is actually not really entirely peaceful with Pakistan. So everybody, including China, is looking at how Russia is faring in Ukraine. For China, it may be a question of thinking, what happens if we do something in Taiwan? Will sanctions be imposed in a similar way? How to duck dependence on the dollar? So those are all important questions. And I think the ramifications of this war, therefore, goes much beyond just the theater in which it is happening. Once again, thank you very much for the floor, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Mohan Kumar. Now I'd like to invite Ambassador Jitendra Nath Mishra. He teaches courses on sports and international relations for our students here. And he's also been ambassador to a number of countries. And he is really a versatile diplomat scholar with a PhD. So I request Dr. Ambassador Jitendra Mishra to come in and weigh in on this, where the world is going, and are we in for more disorder and chaos? Is this just the beginning, or as Ambassador Mohan Kumar seems to think, maybe it's a painful adjustment before a new order? It's the interregnum between two orders. This is a big question, right? And maybe your thoughts on this, please.
Thank you very much, Dean. We are talking, both of you made the point that the war is not over. Exactly. We are talking about the day after, but the day after has not come yet. So therefore, any kind of assessment has to be pure guesswork. And my guesswork is as follows. You mentioned emerging multipolarity. Is there, are we in a phase from the old to the new? I don't know the answers. I think I'm not an astrologer, obviously. I have more questions than answers, because the war is not over. Because the answers will depend to a great extent on the outcome of the war. And we don't know what the outcome of the war is. So therefore, first I'll talk about possible outcomes from the war, and then possible outcomes for the international order, logically following that. Therefore, the outcomes could be a frozen war, goes on, both sides go on fighting, and there is no end to it. The second will be a Russian withdrawal after they have gained sufficient territory to give a land access to Crimea, and of course to the Black Sea. The third is a battlefield stalemate. Fourth is a Ukrainian victory, unlikely in the present circumstances, because even the American president has said that we want this fight to go in a way. Recently, he was quoted in New York Times, Biden, that it should give Ukraine sufficient capacity to negotiate. So there is already thinking that there has to be some kind of a negotiation to end this conflict. A Russian victory, we don't know. Now, everybody knows that the war is not going very well for Russia. However, there are conflicting reports. I don't know what's happening. In the fog of war, difficult to know the truth. But there have been huge losses on both sides. But Russia is a nuclear power. I don't know if any nuclear power has a precedent of accepting conventional defeat. I don't think it has happened. China didn't accept it in the Korean War, for example, even though it was not a nuclear power at that time. And why would Russia accept that? So these are the possibilities. Therefore, the answers to these are mired in guesswork and just educated guesses. Now, we are talking about strategic hedging. I heard from Ambassador Mohan Kumar. Well, I call it possibly non-alignment in a new form, because 70% of the world's population has not taken a stand in support of the West. We tend to forget that. The entire Western media is geared towards talking about the success of Western diplomacy in the as a part of this war effort. But that is not the case. So there is a lot of hedging going on. Now, the Dean mentioned it's a shocking war. Frankly, humanity has infinite capacity to absorb shocks. And this is not the first war, nor is it the last war. I wouldn't say this is the war of all wars. The Treaty of Versailles gives us some historical backdrop. 100 years of peace was possible because all sides had something to work with in an honorable way. But after the First World War, the peace treaty fell apart because of German humiliation, leading to the Second World War. What will happen? We don't know. But there has to be wisdom on all sides for some kind of peace to last. Now, lastly, this war is only accelerating a tendency towards, after the rise of China, towards an emerging bipolar world. Now, the Dean mentioned emerging multipolarity. I hope that's the case. That's what countries like India would want, countries like Japan would want, or Australia and others. But will that happen? That's a huge question. Now, you please remember that when President Clinton was the president, he was talking about a G2 managing the affairs of South Asia in his initial years. And sorry, President Obama, I beg your pardon, not President Clinton. Now, that was very worrisome for countries like India. Will China be managing security and peace in South Asia? Well, that's happening. China is 5.5 times the size of the Indian economy, and I have a lot of data here. India is not even a very consequential Indo-Pacific power in the economic sense of the term. Let's have no illusions about it. So we can't do it alone. So that tendency will perhaps be accelerated because of 2 or 3 factors. One is Russian dependence on China because of the Ukraine war, becoming the junior partner. China gets emboldened. Of course, there are reports that China is quite uncomfortable with what has happened, and the no limits partnership that was announced in the joint statement during the Beijing Winter Olympics. Maybe there is a question mark about that in the Chinese mind. I don't know, but that's what the media suggests. So whatever happens, if there is going to be a kind of emerging multipolarity or bipolarity, it looks like bipolarity with other consequential powers, including Russia, including India, Japan, Australia, Brazil, South Africa, and others trying to hedge their bets by aligning with one side in this conflict to increase their own leverage and their own power to negotiate better outcomes for their national security and foreign policy objectives. So this is what is happening. And we know, of course, the economic consequences, devastating. I'm not going to go into that. Is there a NATO revival? Another question. I'm not so sure. I don't think we should jump to conclusions, because Germany, and Ambassador Mohan Kumar will vouch for this, France, Italy, they are very reluctant to go on fighting this war in the present state. They want this war to wind down because it's hurting their economies and their energy requirements. So therefore, that's a huge question mark. It's the US and the UK.
Thank you, Ambassador.
that
If you
are-
can just,
yeah,
if you
yeah.
can just conclude, because we'll come back to you.
Okay, I would conclude by saying a new Cold War, I'm not sure. Emerging multipolarity, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about anything. But the tendency is towards other countries joining the US and China as partners on both sides, on either side.
Thank you. So there's a realignment, and I think we are all in agreement that there are major realignments happening. I now request Ambassador Abdul Fattah Ammourah. He is our Vice Dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs and Middle East Specialist. Ambassador Ammourah, the thing is that region from which you come from has always faced wars and conflicts. I mean, in fact, these are endemic, structurally embedded in that region. Now, what are the risks from this war, the way you see it? Because Russia has played a very significant military role in the Middle East in recent years. But now Russia has become considerably weakened, and we'll have to see whether it can really continue to exert its influence in the Middle East the way it did during the Syrian war and in Yemen and in Libya and all these places. So what does that do? Because earlier it was said that Russia is filling the vacuum left by a withdrawing United States, or Russia is counterbalancing the US in the region. But now it looks like Russia itself is embroiled. So coming from the Middle East, how does it look looking at this war? Clearly, there are major repercussions for your region, major ripple effects, and also the food shortages. Countries like Egypt, for example, one hears are completely dependent on imports of wheat and corn and all these things. So they are in serious trouble. A lot of the countries in the region depended on for agricultural consumption on Eastern Europe, and they are going to be struggling, and there could be potential social upheavals or even another Arab Spring or revolt. What do you think is happening from your region?
Well, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for inviting me to this meeting. As a matter of fact, the Middle East, or what is called West Asia, has always been facing interstate wars. 11 interstate wars has happened over the past, 70 years or so since the creation of Israel, and also the plan. Let me just focus on that very important region, economically, energy-wise, geostrategic position, that has always been this focus of world super major and superpowers and major powers in the world. Churchill, Kissinger, and others have said, he who controls the oil in the Middle East will win the next war. And Kissinger has come to say later on that he who controls oil and the people in the Middle East. Now, this middle controlling of people, meaning it changed their mind, that has been a longer process. As a matter of fact, I always hear about war in Syria. I would, in a way, from an eyewitness, it is a war against Syria because of its position. It has, always worked for peace. The peace process has failed to an end. I had a chance to be the interpreter of the peace talks. But now, with this focus again on after the Ukraine war, now the world is changing not only after the Ukraine war, but it has been changing after September 11, and after particularly the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq, where they have The American official, Bush and others, have simply said, our aim is to reshape politics in the Middle East. And hence, if you go to 1979, there were major events that have happened. Soviet in Afghanistan, the Iranian Revolution, the Camp David Accords, and the Saddam Hussein coup against Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr. Since then, there has been a new model of wars arising: sectarianism, radicalism, jihadism, interface, which has been manipulated through what is called the Arab Spring. As a matter of fact, the Arab Spring is really not a spring. It is Arab winter, it is Arab summer, fire, wars continue. That proxy war has continued to witness that policy, as a matter of fact. Now, the Middle East, as a matter of fact, people are talking about the Arab NATO, which is really a kind of imagination. But this has been preceded before, just last year, with what is called a Sham alliance, where Egypt, Jordan met in Baghdad. How can a Sham, Bilad Sham alliance be without the participation of the center of Bilad Sham, that is Syria? That reminds of the Baghdad, pact again, which has failed. And I'm sure now they are talking about the possibilities through this normalization of relations between Israel and some Arab countries about the Arab Sunni NATO. But the fact they are talking about Sunni, it means against Iran. And is it possible? Is it feasible? How it will work? We could see that that is also an imagination to have this, because Egypt has its own calculations. Iraq has its own calculations. Now the struggle and the struggle now is who will control this Middle East? Who is the major power? Is it Turkey, for example? Is it Israel? Is it Iran? Is it Saudi Arabia? Now we could notice that without any settlement for the Ukraine war and so on, especially when the sanctions against the Russian and energy gas of Russia and the counter sanctions now, Biden and the American, Europe is in danger now. The aging Europe is in danger. So there is a need to think of really where the settlement and the compromise should be. But the compromise should not be to sacrifice your national interests, national security, geopolitics. People have died, destruction is everywhere, but still there is major powers. Resistance in Lebanon. See now what is happening in Lebanon, for example.
Ambassador Ammourah, I request you if you can, conclude, because we hope to have a second.
So there are, as a matter of fact, new alliances emerging in the world. And these alliances will be the landmarks for the multipolar world order. And the world order, to remain as it is like a lame man walking, but it will be destabilizing the whole security and the threat to the national security and the interest of the developing countries in particular, and for the sake of the two major powers that are taking. India can play a role. India is looked for in the lens of the Middle East as a balancer. Very well foreign policy conducted. Thank you, Mr. Dean, for your interview the other day. And I would be pleased to answer any question. The Arab League, finally, the Arab League, they are talking now about demolishing the Arab League and establishing a regional organization whereby Turkey, Israel could be in it as regional Middle Eastern organization to put an end to the inter-Arab cooperation and so on. There is a huge resistance and rejection
Thank you,
of
sir.
this idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Interesting points made by Ambassador Ammourah. I think there is a parallel to Iran in the Middle East with Russia in Europe. I mean, Iran has also sought to be excluded, and Iran has always felt that it needs to revise, and it's a revisionist power in the region, because it is often seen to be marginalized or not respected. And Russia seems to have a similar viewpoint about its interests in Europe, which seem to have been disregarded. So the issue is not just a war, but also, as Ambassador Ammourah is talking about, of national security. And I want to draw in my colleague, Professor Deepshikha Shahi. She's a theoretician and writes about international relations theory. She teaches the IR theories and praxis course, which is the first course in the MA IRSS degree program of Coursera. And so in many ways, students, those of you who are enrolling in our program, your first interface is with Professor Deepshikha Shahi. And she, I want to ask her, take her a little bit towards theory also. Of course, the audience is all probably not very familiar with it, but Professor Shahi, when you see this war and you see the way in which it could have been prevented but could not be prevented, and the Russians said that security is indivisible. You can't say that you can put forces on our border and then you expect us not to do nothing. And on the other hand, the Ukrainian point of view was that security is inviolable and it is a principle of international law. It looked to me like there is a liberal argument that a small country must be protected by international law and that the big powers should respect sovereignty of all states. But on the other hand, the realist theory would say that there is a security dilemma here, and Russia tried to break out of it, however clumsily and however excessively, but it tried to break out of this cordon, as it saw, or this menace on its doorstep of NATO. So your thoughts on it looks, and the way the war has gone, it seems like it's a victory of realism over liberalism, or am I wrong?
Well, thank you, Professor Chaulia, for providing me the opportunity to speak on this issue. I'll talk more about how our program MAIRSS helps us to decode the situation. We have all talked about the transforming world order, a new world order, which is still in the making after the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war. Well, the ideas of war and peace have always served as the core themes of international relations. If we look at IR as an academic discipline, according to the conventional wisdom as demonstrated by E.H. Carr's classic, The 20 Years' Crisis, published in 1946, IR was conceived on the blood-stained battlefields of Europe. It was the traumatic experiences of interwar years, that is, the period between the two world wars, starting from 1919 to 1939, that compelled IR to fulfill its noble mission. That is, the mission to eradicate war and poverty, thereby securing growth for all peoples inhabiting this globe. Later, the critical studies of the Cold War and post-Cold War phases offered a more holistic, or shall I say, a more non-Eurocentric historiographical account, and argued that IR's post-1919 mission was primarily about averting war in Europe, not in non-European parts, so as to preserve the Western civilization. For all practical purposes, it became commonsensical to assume that war was no longer thinkable in Europe. Furthermore, it was held that the spread of Western liberal democracy in non-Western parts, as affirmed by Francis Fukuyama's classic, The End of History and the Last Man, published in 1992, could go a long way in enhancing the prospects of peace. Now, unexpectedly, the Russia-Ukraine war demolished the belief that war was no longer thinkable in Europe, and the related claim that enlarging NATO eastward would create an ever-expanding zone of peace. Rather, the Russia-Ukraine war has triggered a vicious cycle of blame game, which has initiated a sort of theoretical warfare in IR, as you briefly mentioned in your introduction. So the liberal theorists blame the Russian President Putin for the outbreak of war and claimed that his illegal invasion proved that the idea of NATO's eastward enlargement had nothing whatsoever to do with his decision to go for war against Ukraine. But the realist theorists blame the liberal ideologues who dismissed Russia's repeated protests against the idea of NATO's eastward enlargement and continued to press a revisionist program in Europe with little regard for the security dilemma that this revisionist program generated in the first place. A few realist theorists interpret the Russian invasion as its inevitable quest for hegemony in the balance of power. Therefore, they ask, why blame anyone, let alone the US? Nonetheless, both liberal and realist theorists agree that the strategies to weaponize interdependence by imposing economic sanctions and the attempts to manipulate political opinion via the UN General Assembly's voting condemning the invasion have been grimly deficient in bringing an end to the war. In the meanwhile, the constructivist IR theorists have come forward to explain a series of miscalculations that became obvious during the war. For instance, the West's miscalculations when it lost sight of the military penalties of NATO's eastward enlargement. Ukraine's miscalculations when it hoped that its involvement in NATO's eastward enlargement might facilitate its speedy acquisition of the EU membership. Also, Russia's miscalculations when it underrated Ukrainian resolve, overstated its army's ability to deliver a swift and costless victory, and misread how the West was likely to respond. Theoretically speaking, several critical theorists have tried to offer a more layered explanation by shedding light on some overlooked aspects. For instance, the feminist theorists have diagnosed the notions of masculinity, especially Putin's own macho personality cult, as a variable while explaining the possible causes and consequences of this war. And the cultural theorists have investigated the domestic psychological factors underpinning the aggressive designs of this war. Intriguingly, the global IR or non-Western IR theorists have declared that the ongoing Russia-Ukraine crisis have put the final nail in the coffin of the post-war liberal order, thereby paving the road for a multiplex world order. That is a world order that prioritizes issue-oriented governance involving multiple Western and non-Western actors, not just a few selected Western actors who enjoy great power status. Certainly, in this multiplex world order, the non-Western actors coming from Russia, China, India, Brazil, and the Middle East will not only find more room to play, but also write their own playbooks or say form their own rules of the game. Against the backdrop of these changing times, our program MAIRSS offers an opportunity to learn about the theoretical and practical nuts and bolts of IR. Theoretically, it enables students to accomplish a threefold objective. First, noticing the shifts in the dominating meanings of international relations theory. Second, emphasizing how the Western inclination of international relations theory right from the beginning sidelined non-Western experiences and discourses. And third, showing how the recent infusion of non-Western experiences and discourses can highlight the complementarities between Western and non-Western IR theories. Now, one might rightly wonder, what is the practical use of Western and non-Western IR theories? Can one mobilize these theories only to grow knowledge or pass judgment about world politics? Or can one extract the policy level implications of these
Thank
theories
you,
to
Dr. Shahi.
prescribe?
I'm sorry to interrupt you. We are trying to ration the time. So if you can just wind up.
I'm just winding up. I just provided a brief overview of how different theories can throw different kinds of lights on the recent developments with regard to Russia-Ukraine crisis and how theoretical insights are also practically useful. So I'll just briefly mention how in our program, we try to encourage our students to go through a thought experiments whereby we ask them to formulate some critical creative solutions that could translate IR theories into doable policy actions. Here, our pedagogical goal is not to prepare direct feedback for practitioners, but we try to synthesize these students to an increasingly inconsistent and interconnected world. When we train our students, when we encourage them to go through these kinds of thought experiments, we assume that it is these students who would in time become scholars, social activists, journalists, corporate workers, engaged citizens, policy analysts, and perhaps also practitioners. So with these preliminary thoughts, I would stop here and I'm open to all kinds of questions. Thank you for listening.
Professor Shahi. Yes, theory. Folks, students, we have 220 of you watching us live. I can tell you theory is important. You may not see the value of it, but when you enroll in the program and do it in the first semester, it is the building block for the rest of the course. So international relations theories and praxis taught by Professor Deepshikha Shahi, very important, and a brilliant scholar, and you're going to learn so much from her. Okay, I am now privileged to also introduce you to two of our international faculty members, or full-time international faculty members. We have quite a few of them here in Jindal, but most relevant for this discussion, I'm pleased to introduce you to my colleague, Professor Oleksandr Svitych. He teaches philosophy and ethics, but more importantly, he's Ukrainian. And they have been going through a lot of suffering, and our heart goes out to them. And more importantly, as a scholar, he's also been writing and advocating for solutions to this war. Professor Svitych, you are a philosopher, and maybe you can rationalize what is happening, but I don't think people thought that it would all come crumbling down, the entire post-1991 order like this. And the way in which that whole order has been assaulted, I mean, it's just most observers, I think most Ukrainians didn't believe it. And if you yourself will recall the weeks running up to February 24th, the Russian invasion, most people thought it is never going to happen and that Putin is just bluffing. But there was the backdrop of this back and forth between NATO and Russia gave a list of demands. So, I mean, your thoughts on this? I mean, what, from a Ukrainian point of view, obviously you're fighting for survival, fighting for land, fighting for continuing to exist as a sovereign state. So what is the Ukrainian perspective on this war? I would like you to please speak about this so that the global audience we have from probably more than 40 countries can understand your perspective.
Thank you very much, Professor Chaulia, and I'm happy to be on this panel. And by the way, I really appreciate the comments from my colleagues. Excellent thoughts, very thought-provoking. And I just would like, before I answer the question, I would like to build a bit on Deepshikha's point that we need multi-layered explanations. I totally agree. And by the way, my initial background is also in IR. And in this regard, I think it's important to say that, and I have said this repeatedly, by the way, that although NATO argument is very important, and Russia indeed may have perceived legitimate concerns, security concerns, and the key word here is perceived. This is not in itself enough to explain the war. And of course, it's not enough to justify the war. And I think in this regard, at least from my perspective and from the perspective of many Ukrainian, common people, laymen, the key word here is identity. Okay, so this is the war between different visions of our future. And I think this is actually an intensification of the trend which we have seen with the rise of populism around the world. And Russia is an extreme case where the state justifies its existence and actually builds its identity by looking into the past. Okay, and there are different reasons for this, and they can be debated. But in fact, drawing on the imperialist, colonialist, legacy on the Soviet past, is how Russia is actually trying to legitimize its rule and how it's trying to build its own identity. So, and this, theoretically speaking, this echoes more constructivist theories, right? So I just would like to make two more points. My second point is that from a more political, philosophical perspective, as Professor Chaulia has pointed out, I think a good way to approach the war is from a just war theory perspective, right? Which is actually in between realism and pacifism. right? So just war theory says war can be just or unjust in causes or means, all right? And according to just war theories, there are two important principles, a violation of which constitutes aggression and calls for the right to defense. And these two principles are, as many of you know, territorial integrity and political sovereignty. And in the case of the Russia-Ukraine war, these two principles have been clearly violated. And my last concluding point is maybe a bit more thought-provoking, and I would like to echo the thoughts of our ambassadors, Mohan, Kumar, and Ambassador Mishra. I'm not sure that negotiation is possible right now. I don't think Russia is prepared for diplomacy, nor is it interested in diplomacy. And in my opinion, this is what is actually not taken into account, that for Putin, for Vladimir Putin and his counterparts, diplomacy may be a sign of weakness. So from this perspective, it's still maybe a bit too early to call for a diplomatic solution. On this note, I would like to thank everyone. Thank you, Professor Chaulia and fellow panelists. Thank you for your time, and I'm passing the word on.
Professor Chaulia, you're on mute.
Sreeram, you are on mute.
You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Svitych. Thank you for bringing in the valuable Ukrainian perspective. Now, viewers, I have got something very interesting. My colleague from Russia, Professor Tatiana Belousova, she teaches Eastern Europe, Soviet, post-Soviet space, and also war and peace issues. And she's also joining us today. And she is not a typical Russian in the sense she's lived abroad, studied abroad, has acquired overseas degrees, and she teaches at Jindal School of International Affairs. Professor Belousova, your thoughts? It's been quite a devastating war and quite gut-wrenching. Many of us have really felt it, but for you especially, given the severe economic downturn that's been forecast, despite the oil and gas prices propping up the Russian economy for the moment, it does look like this was a strategic mistake, would you say, of President Putin, because it doesn't seem to have achieved the objectives. For example, Finland and Sweden have now also applied to join NATO. So instead of pushing back NATO, it looks like it has given, as Ambassador Mishra was saying, maybe a new lease of life for NATO, which means that now this cycle of conflict seems to be getting worse and worse. There are more countries now across Russia's borders that will be equipped with NATO weaponry and NATO forces. So are we now entering some kind of a spiral where these wars are just going to go on and on endlessly? Your thoughts, Professor Belousova?
I think those were complete miscalculations on the part of President Putin.
Could you just turn up your volume, please? It's very low.
I can speak louder. Technically, I am not sure how to handle that. Am I audible now? So yeah. It was miscalculation. It was miscalculation, definitely. But I don't think Mr. Putin will ever acknowledge that. Yeah, that he has made a strategic mistake. So even when the war, because the topic of our today's roundtable is the world after the Ukraine war. So in my opinion, even when the war comes to an end, there will be many long-term consequences and challenges going forward. The relations between Russia and the West will remain tense, with an absolute mistrust and animosity towards each other. We can hardly hope for any détente anytime soon, unless some unexpected circumstances come into play and change the status quo. In this sense, we can continue using the term Cold War 2.0, which basically describes the strategic rivalry between the powerful stakeholders. In fact, this time we are having a double-track Cold War, means between the US and China and Russia and the West. The one between Russia and the West no longer contains an ideological dimension. Neither there is a strictly defined bloc politics surrounding it. Despite the presence of competing alliances like Quad and BRICS, some countries prefer to take a neutral stance or maintain good relations with both quote-unquote camps. Some experts call these hybrid alliances. The countries that have not joined sanctions against Russia will be viewed by Russia as the friendly nation. Russia has already started its charm offensive with the countries like Egypt, Ethiopia, and Congo that Mr. Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, visited this week itself. I think the key question here is the future European security architecture. It will be a very unfortunate scenario if we are living with the constant fear of tension and escalation between Russia and the NATO members. For this reason, there should be lots of genuine diplomatic efforts to find workable solutions to this European crisis. There are multiple dimensions here, and this conflict seems to be too complex to handle. Nonetheless, there should be lots of negotiations and written obligations signed between the NATO members and Russia in order to ensure a more or less stable Europe. At the moment, we are clearly at the stalemate, but at some point we will have to get out of it. Some analysts say the intense fighting will continue until autumn, when weather conditions make it logistically difficult to continue the fight. What I heard recently from the Russian officials, they still refer to their initial grievances, such as NATO expansion, Russia's insecurity, and treatment of ethnic Russians in the eastern part of Ukraine. Perhaps these concerns should be addressed during future negotiations and agreements. And finally, we are still not sure how the territorial issues will be solved. Whether Ukraine will be able to take back some of its territories captured by Russia. Will Russia take over more territories in the east and south of Ukraine? And if Russia retains most of the Lugansk region, for example, then how it will be governing all these newly acquired territories? I think we can expect instances of civil disobedience, protests, and insurgencies. Because after what Russia has done, it might take generations before Russians and Ukrainians become true brothers and sisters again. So these are the points I wanted to bring forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Belousova. It's quite a candid and a self-critical view of what's been happening. So students, many of you have been shooting us questions. One of the common threads I see in the questions is about the plight of developing countries. Now they are caught in the crossfire, so to say, and each of them is struggling to make ends meet because of what the UN is calling a triple whammy: food, fuel, and financial crisis. All three-dimensional crisis. So, but they don't seem to have any stake in bringing about a solution. They are only have a voice in the UN General Assembly where they voted. Majority of 140 or so countries voted against the Russian invasion. But other than that, you just look at the world order we are talking about, what kind of world order it is. The bulk of humanity is suffering from this war and its after effects, the inflation and the supply chain bottlenecks and the shortages. But on the other hand, they have no say in trying to bring this war to a close. They're just watching and hoping and praying that the war stops. So that should get you all to think about what kind of world order it is and how unfair it is. Ukraine has legitimate rights to feel that it has been hard done by and that it's really been victimized. But so are many other countries who have nothing to do with NATO or with the security dynamics of Eastern Europe. So just think about the spillover. There have been a number of wars that have drawn in great powers in recent years, but not on this scale. So just the ripple effects of it are much bigger than other conflicts. For example, I know there are some from Ethiopia in the audience, and you've been asking questions about Ethiopia. There was a war in Ethiopia that was pretty bad with Tigray, but it remained confined. The effects of it did not become global. But because bigger powers are involved, because Russia is there, because NATO is involved, this has just had a spillover effect on energy security, on food prices, on essential commodities. The UN is saying we are facing a food crisis not seen in generations, and especially in Africa. And the question for them is not about who is right or who is wrong in the Ukraine-Russia war. It's about just making ends meet. Students, there are a lot of questions, and I don't think we have time to really answer all of them, but I'll do a little mini round with each one of our speakers, 30 seconds only. What kind of world is this? I mean, try to be as brief as possible. What kind of world are we entering? And are we even prepared for it? Or is it, are we going to be further shocked and surprised? Ambassador Mohan Kumar?
Oh, thank you very much. I think it's a very, very messy world we have entered into. And I think there's no doubt in my mind that the Ukraine war was the tipping point. I think it really has upended the world order as we knew it. In terms of implications, I think it's going to be each country for itself. There has been a colossal failure of multilateralism. That's one issue we haven't discussed. There's been a failure of the UN Security Council. There has been a failure of the European security architecture in terms of ability for Europe to deal with its own issues. And finally, there has been a failure also of the WTO, the World the Food and Agricultural Organization, and so on. So that is the reason why I think we find ourselves in this situation. It's a very, very bleak kind of world, Sreeram. That's all I will say. Thank you.
Yeah, short, nasty, and brutish. That's what Thomas Hobbes called the state of nature. And if you go by the realist theory of international relations, we are back in that kind of a world where it's the law of the jungle, not international law or international organizations that are able to manage things. Ambassador Mishra, 30 seconds. What kind of world order are we entering?
Nasty, brutish, and short. And as I said before, the transformation from the Cold War or the post-Cold War order to something new was already going on with the rise of China. So I don't see the Ukraine war as a tipping point of history in the 21st century. I only see it as a phase in the developments which will accelerate ongoing developments, which is rise of China, senior partner, Russia, junior partner, US, senior partner, Europe, junior partner, and countries like India go back to their hedging and non-alignment. So it's not fundamentally different from the Cold War, except that the roles have reversed between China and Russia.
Very, very well stated. I hope students will think about this. Ambassador Ammourah, 30 seconds, sir. What kind of world are we entering? You need to unmute yourself, please.
I believe we are entering another stage of a long, protracted wars, proxy wars, as long as this Russia-Ukraine war, Russia-US relation, Russia-EU relations, it seems to me they are escalating. And also the US-China are really very serious, where provocations are there. North Korea, Iran, Israel. Now I pose the question, can anybody tell me why the Americans are on the Syrian territory in the most rich, fertile energy resources? This is rubbish. This is international law. Is this the order that we want? You know, the United Nations can, I believe, should play a role, but can it play a role with the framework as it is now in international relations? The only hope, lastly, is that the BRICS really is showing some kind of refocusing, whereby it has been reported that Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and possibly Iran will very shortly apply for joining, and they have been invited joining the BRICS. This
there is an
means
expansion.
that.
Thank you, Ambassador.
you.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's indeed a failure, collective failure that we are all looking at, staring at, one only hopes that it doesn't deteriorate into a broader global war or a world war. I mean, cold wars are bad enough, but hot wars are worse. Let me also request Professor Shahi, your thoughts on what kind of world we are entering.
I think I have a slightly different viewpoint. I don't think we are living or we are going to live in a Hobbesian, realist kind of a world order anymore. That's because realist theory basically talks about the notion of hegemonic stability, that there is a hegemon, a single or a cluster of major powers who dictate terms and conditions, who set the rules, and that regime, that set of rules leads to peace or stability. I don't think that's happening anywhere. We can't look at the US as the hegemon, or the UK for that matter. Even within Europe, you know how the incident of Brexit has led to an overhaul in the balance of power within Europe. So what I see is that the multiplex world order is slowly emerging, wherein all kinds of Western, non-Western countries would play a crucial role. What would be the outcome of that is still not foreseeable in the near future. But I think it would be a more equitable world order where we would have non-Western countries also playing a crucial role.
Right. So maybe there's a silver lining. As they say, things have to get a lot worse before they get better, but maybe a better and more equitable world order is emerging. You can't see it right now, but maybe 5-10 years down the line, we will see that, hopefully. Professor Belousova, what kind of world order is this? Is it a dog eat dog kind of a world order, or something more hopeful likely to emerge?
I believe in the emerging multipolarity. And not only that, but also its ability to soften the new Cold War realities. And I also believe in the notion of responsible players with benign power. And in this sense, let me just quote Kenneth Waltz in his famous theory of international politics, dated 1979, when he mentioned that in the absence of a supreme or unchallengeable power, the international system functions as a quote-unquote, self-help system in which states are forced to prioritize survival and security over all other goals. So this is the notion I strongly believe in.
Thank you, Professor Balu. Security over all other goals. Indeed, we are entering that, seems to be entering that era. What happened to globalization? What happened to interdependence? Just 5 to 10 years ago, they were saying it's inevitable, it's inexorable, it's unstoppable. Globalization is the trend of the future. There's so many stakeholders that it can never be overthrown. And now suddenly, the gas wars in Europe, for example, are showing interdependence does not stop wars. And interdependence actually can be weaponized. So, very drastic time.
We need to learn lots of lessons from this conflict. I hope we will be prudent enough to learn these lessons.
Absolutely. And students, I want you to think about what happened to globalization. What happened to that globalization that was seen as the overarching framework in which all the international relations were being organized? What happened to that globalization? Please think about it. We are almost out of time. I request Professor Svitych, last word on what kind of world order are we in?
I think we're entering the world order where more and more often governments, and especially authoritarian governments, deploy identity politics to legitimize their rule. And I do believe that in this world order, identity trumps security. And this leads me to the final point, the question asked to me directly in the chat, how to stop the violence in the best way. It was from Tina. The best way, in my opinion, is not diplomacy, but regime change in Russia, which can come from 3 things combined together: international pressure, civil disobedience, and coup d'etat. So we'll see if that happens.
We'll see what happens. Well, is this the second Afghanistan of Russia? That's another question, students, I want you all to think about, because the first time they did a fateful intervention like this, 1979, 1980, it ended up in the breakup of the Soviet Union. So we'll have to see whether there'll be regime change or collapse. But that seems far away for the moment. The gas and oil prices are keeping them going for now. Last but not least, I want to introduce my colleague, Professor Devika Mishra, who's been patiently hearing us. She's the student success coordinator. She's the overall dean for the online master's program and the what we call the coordinator for the program. So, Professor Mishra, over to you. Your appeal to students. They've had a feast for the last 1 hour in terms of intellectual dialogue about the most pressing international issue. But how can they further their interest in this field by applying to our degree? Over to you, Professor Mishra.
Thank you, Professor Chaulia, and thank you to all the panelists for your very diverse views. I personally learned a lot, and I just have like 2 quick summations. So why me speaking right now about this degree is important in a panel where we've already had so many thoughts and so many opinions shared, both by the panelists as well as by the audience members. So we talked about multipolarities, we talked about new non-alignment, we talked about how the international crisis is being used by domestic politics to kind of raise these concerns and not really deal with them. We talked about failures of multilateralism. We talked about hopes for multilateralism. We talked about failures of sanctions. And amidst all of this, amidst a variety of opinions that have been shared continuously, I've been reading the student questions that have sort of come up. And 3 were very important. The first question was, what can be these sorts of questions, what can be a global peace, what can be a world order? So this willingness to sort of analyze and understand what will the future look like. Then the second sort of questions that came up were the many different possibilities. Somebody was talking about how the G20 summit is going to happen in Indonesia. Somebody was talking about how countries like India might play a role. Somebody was talking about how China might be very instrumental in this entire dynamic, amidst a variety of others. So varieties of possibilities when people globally come together and talk together. And finally, the third really important question that some student put up, how do I understand what's right and what's wrong? There's all this fake news flying around. How do I make sense? What is the astute thing that I should be studying? And that's where I would like to pitch that you should apply for the Masters in International Relations, Security and Strategy, because that is precisely where globalization that Professor Chaulia was just saying doesn't seem to be working. All of us sitting down together, sharing perspectives, building on each other's opinions, exposing ourselves to new information that especially we as an Indian university teaching IR have access to, with this array of international scholars who are continuously working together. That question about having Oleksandr and Tatiana talk to each other, that's precisely what learning is. Forgetting national identities and chasing your curiosity. So you should go and look at our page, look at our various webinars, look at our various admission videos, and see what we are doing with international relations, security, and strategy. We'll help you build critical skills that will help you understand what's the truth and what isn't. That will give you skills to hopefully come up with your own solutions, to come up with one of these various possibilities. And most importantly, that will give you access to a global classroom filled with internationalist teachers, filled with students and students coming not only from all over the world, but from all walks of life. You could be a retired diplomat and you would be in IRSS, or you could be a fresh graduate who just wants to understand how to read news. And all of you come down together and do this excellent degree that we've been working very hard to curate for the last year. We've already had 2 very successful cohorts run. This is our 3rd cohort. Admissions are open. Our classes will go live on 1st of September. Please take a look, write to us at JGU, at online@jgu.edu.in. Take a look at all our webinars. And I know for a fact that Anshul and the other admissions team are holding specific question-based hours for the IRSS program on the 4th of August and on the 15th of August. So if you have more questions for the degree, please come in and join us there. And maybe maybe you never know, one day you could be one of the many esteemed panelists who were talking about these issues, who had new insights, and you could synthesize and you could know why you were saying what you were saying. So that's where I'll stop, because I know we're very short on time, but if there are any questions at all about the degree program, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you, Professor Chaulia.
Thank you to all my esteemed colleagues. Thank you to the audience for patiently hearing us and absorbing many things. We have thrown a lot of questions at you. So please engage amongst yourselves, debate these, but we're going to be giving you a bigger opportunity to continue learning about these issues in a more systematic way. A webinar is not as systematic as a degree program. The webinar is just a kind of a teaser. The real show, folks, is the MA IRSS degree program. We look forward to your applications and to evaluating them. And hopefully, if you can make it, we hope to welcome you into the next cohort. Last year, 2021, we had students from over 35 nationalities. Just think about the diversity in the classroom that's coming. And it's unprecedented, this kind of global education on Coursera. So please send in your applications. There is no application fee. And my team with Anshul and others will get back to you as soon as they receive the applications. So happy learning, and thank you all. And let's keep focusing on the big problems of our times, whether we have solutions or not. First of all, understanding the problem itself is one step towards a solution. The problem, as Professor Mishra was saying, is many of us don't even know what is actually happening on the ground and what is the reality and what is the truth. I saw one questioner asking a very fundamental question: why is this war happening? I want you all to think about it. No time to discuss it any further in a webinar, but more in the degree program. So please join the MA IRSS, and we'll see you again soon as our students. Take care. Best wishes. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.